Okay, as an attempt to help pass the time with this lockdown, I'm trying to do a movie based on the cars we have owned or driven, and including little bits of stories of what happened around these cars and our marriage we have gone through so far. The first one is this Nash Ambassador. I bought it in about 1967 in Petersburg. Don't remember much about it. I know it had overdrive, which at that stage was amazing for a car, and it used to cut down the fuel consumption by 30% or something like that. Didn't have it for long, but that was my first car. Unfortunately, I do not have photos of all of the cars that belong to us. Some of these have been taken off the web. So those with strange numbers on the number plates, they were taken off the web. A 1961 DKW Auto Union. What a magnificent little old car that was. Way ahead of its time with so many of its features. You could cover up the radiator, I remember, from inside if it was too cold outside that it didn't freeze solid. The speedometer used to run vertically, not around the gauge, and it would change colors depending on the speed you were doing. If you went over 50 miles, it was still miles per hour, 50 miles per hour or so, it turned red and it started off green. Quite amazing. I took out this engine endlessly. It had 3 breaker points, I think they were called, that had to be set to make this 2-stroke engine run in time. And my wonderful old mom used to help me get this engine out of this DKW because I had no tools, nothing to lift it with, and the battery was permanently flat. I remember after fixing it one time, I took it out on the road to Zanin for a ride, and it was raining, and the lights were so bad they used to fall on the road. They didn't shine ahead, they fell on the road. And as I went over this one little hill or little rise, there was a dead cow in the road, and I slammed on the brakes and I went into this enormous skid, and it just went round and round and round and round, and I ended up next to the side of the road. And luckily the engine didn't cut out because I wouldn't be able to get it started. But I went back home very carefully. I started visiting at the Redhead at this time, and when I used to leave her late at night, perhaps even early morning sometimes, she used to help me push the car to be able to get it started. We had to push it quite away from the house because it was a pretty rackety engine. Otherwise, an old man would have heard it. Forgot to mention in the previous part of the video that I was working at Barclays Bank at that stage, $90 a month, can you believe it? And my old man, $50 went for rent that I had to pay him, no messing about with that. There wasn't a lot of extra money for cars and messing around and so on. I then moved from Barclays Bank. I got a job at a place called Reckitt and Coleman. Don't think they exist anymore, but I was a merchandiser for them. Whoopee! And I got a company car. This was the first one. It was a Ford Cortina station wagon. Once again, don't remember much about it, but I remember riding it like hell. You know, company cars can do much better than 4x4s and Ferraris and things like that. Great little car. Can't ever remember it giving me any trouble. I don't think I was particularly successful as a merchandiser. Never had any artistic capabilities, and I soon found myself driving this little Anglia panel van. Cute little car, and what I had to do was I had to carry stock of Nugget shoe polish, which was one of the products that Reckitt and Coleman sold, and sell it from one little shop to the next little cobbler shop to the next little cobbler shop. Most of these were Italians at that stage, and I can remember the arguments, no, I not want to buy 6, I only want to buy 2. And I could do this, of course, carrying the loose merchandise in the car with me, and it went quite well. Something I learned about cars with this one is that I stayed in Kensington, and that particular winter was freezing cold, and the car stayed outside. I went off, and 2 blocks later it started boiling, and I thought, hey, it's freezing, how can this car be boiling? But of course, when you do that and you leave the car outside, when you go off, the radiator freezes up. And this is what had happened, of course. So a lesson learned. I must have done pretty well with that little Anglia panel van, being a door-to-door salesman of Nugget shoe polish. And soon the company decided I wasn't able to carry enough stock with me in the small Anglia, so they got me this Volkswagen panel van. Really an amazing vehicle. I really enjoyed driving it. And fond memories. It was the time of the hippies, of course, and the Volkswagens with the windows in it, the panel vans with the old Volkswagen Combis, were of course known as passion wagons. And I know the kids will be listening to this, so I'm not going to say too much, but I've got fond memories of this particular panel van. Meanwhile, Of course, this was all in Joburg because I was working in Joburg at that time. But back at home in Petersburg, Marie, we weren't married at that stage, was working at the Air Force Base. And she had to be able to get from home to work. And I bought this Hillman for her. I can for the life of me not remember where I got it. I can hardly remember any detail about it. But I remember working on it quite often with my soon-to-be father-in-law. And this got us a bit closer because he didn't quite appreciate the Donderse Engelsman that was visiting his daughter. And we sorted out a few things on this little Hillman. One of them I remember was it still had those indicator lights that came out on the door, just on the door support. And the switch for the indicators was on the steering wheel, in the middle of the steering wheel, not like today on the stalk, but where the horn is, where the hoot is. And there was this little switch you turned from side to side. The Hillman didn't last for too long, and I bought this Austin A40 from an advert in the Star newspaper for 50 Rand in Johannesburg. I drove it up to Petersburg, and the rings were beyond had it. So I don't think I ever got much above 30 kilometers an hour. I remember going through Pretoria, I picked up a guy, and he and I had been on a course when I still worked at Barclays Bank. Quite by chance, I picked him up, and he travelled with me for a while, and then he said, "No, hey man, this is not going to work. I'm never going to get home." He was hiking on his way to Zanin, and he said, "No, drop me off. I'll rather hitchhike further and see if I don't get a better lift," which I did. And I kept on ambling away, and I eventually got up to Port Elizabeth at about, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning, and here's somebody standing hiking next to the road, and I stopped to pick him up. Lo and behold, the same guy. So I managed to get him through to Petersburg eventually. It was a real character car. Those old English cars had those great gauges and this huge steering wheel, and as I've already said, the indicator switch on the horn in the middle of the steering wheel. And I did up this engine totally for the Redhead. Put on new rings. I bored out the block for new pistons. I ground the valves. I don't know where I got the money from to buy the spares from, but this was a real great car that we had for quite a while. Of course, something else to remember on these old cars was the fact that the dip switches on the Hillman and on this Austin were on the floor still at that stage. This was the time that you definitely stopped at the stop streets. You came to a dead stop. Firstly, because if you didn't stop dead, you would get a fine, not compared to anything like today. And the second thing is that these cars didn't have synchro on their first gear, so the only way to get it into gear to pull away was to come to an absolute dead stop. I then got another job at BP Oil Company as an agricultural representative, and it was in Petersburg because the Redhead and I were getting married, and this was the first company car I had there, a Peugeot 404. They were built like tanks. One thing I remember is that they had brakes you could not believe in. Even compared to today's wonderful braking systems, those Peugeots could brake. Just looking at this photo, I see how thick my arms are. And looking at them now, they are spindly. So that was quite some time back. You'll see in Marie's arms, there's a little Pekingese dog, which my new manager had given to me. And that was 51 years ago. And in those 51 years, we've always had at least one Pekingese in our household. We've really come to love them. I just had that first Peugeot for a little while. This was the next Peugeot that I got. Much the same as the previous one, but this photo was taken near a place called Houtbosdorp, and I was due to go away for that 3-week army training camp that we used to have to go on. And Marie was pregnant with our first child, and he just wouldn't arrive. So I took her, this was the worst gravel road I could think of, and I took her for a ride on this gravel road in the hopes that all the bumping and bouncing would make him arrive a bit earlier. But to no avail, he arrived at his own time. This was the same Peugeot, yet we just arrived back from a long holiday trip down all around the coast. Of course, as she gets out the Redhead, it's got to have the hair combed, very important. But looking at the Peugeot itself, still had the roof rack on those days with a cover in case it rained. And if you look carefully in the front, you'll still see the old canvas water bag, which kept the water cold because there were no Kentuckys, one-stops and all those sort of things along the way. Another thought that occurred to me that was, I wonder how many people who travel that road today will know, well, obviously it was not tarred, but when I was busy doing my work at that stage, the road was only tarred from Petersburg to Dendron. From Dendron all the way up to Aldays and beyond, it was very bad gravel road. And I still remember the manager that gave us the Pekingese saying that one day you'll be able to tell people that you rode on this road when it was still a gravel road. And that's what I'm doing now. The names that I can recall. Not places, just names. Evangelina, Lechkrol, One that always thrilled me, a place called Bale Steel. What happened there that was called Bale Steel? But great memories.